Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to our session. A familiar stranger, Franz Boas in Contexts. And I'd like to extend my gratitude and all of us, on behalf of all of us, our thanks to Ann Stahl and the AAA Executive Committee for putting us on the executive program. It's a real honor, and I'm very pleased to be able to share much of our collaborative project with you all today. Excuse me. The Franz Boas Papers Documentary Edition is a Social Science Humanities Research Council funded project, collaboration between several partners. Our PI, Regna Darnell, is on the panel, and what you're about to hear are several papers. That's a small sample of some of the collaborations we've been working on in our reassessment of Boas's career and the networks that Boas is involved in. And it's really been a fantastic project, and I'm so pleased to share the stage with so many of my esteemed colleagues. I'm going to jump into my paper. I'm Joshua Smith, and the title of my paper is Sovereign Anthropologies, Boas, Indian Law and U.S. Indian Policy in the Interwar Period. But I'm going to focus on Archie Finney and Boas's relationship. Archie Finney was Nimipu, also known as the Nez Perce, and he did his dissertation, published as the Nez Perce Texts, with Franz Boas. He studied at the Academy of Sciences in Leningrad between 1933 and 1937 before returning home. He eventually worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and was one of the original founders of the National Congress of American Indians in 1944. His time in Leningrad was dedicated to studying the political relations between the Russian state and the indigenous minorities as a comparison to the colonial context in the U.S. The letters between Boas and Finney helped to understand Boas's position on U.S. Indian policy, a position that was profoundly informed by Boas's interactions with his student, Archie Finney. On April 7, 1931, Boas wrote to Commissioner C.J. Rhodes outlining his intentions. C.J. Rhodes was the Indian commissioner from 1929 to 1933. In that letter, he criticized assimilation policy, and Boas pushed the idea that each particular indigenous community ought to inform policy. Moreover, Boas argued against the ideology of what he referred to as liberal equality as assimilatory, and that indigenous laws should be the basis of policy as well. Boas tactfully puts forth 4 proposals to Rhodes in this letter. First, Boas denounces the theories and policies of assimilation. Second, Boas recognizes that the life of most Indian communities is troubling, but he asserts that the solution to overcoming these challenges is for the government to recognize and encourage Indian culture as the best means for assisting them in overcoming their difficulties, and what he referred to as a sense of their hopelessness. Third, Boas suggests where Rhodes might find people with the right expertise to shift policy in this direction. And fourth, Boas invokes the example of the Colonial Service of Great Britain in order to emphasize the importance for officials to understand native law and native customs, together with the Russian example of recognizing the rights and the ability of their native peoples to develop in accordance with their own cultures. In retrospect, Boas obviously overestimates the effects of both the British colonial service and Russian policies, but his tactics are to impress upon Rhodes the possibility of turning to indigenous legal orders, particular to each community, as starting points to shift Indian policy to be in keeping with what he famously refers to as the native point of view. That is, each community's political problem, as they might define it on their own terms in keeping with their own legal orders, ontologies, and epistemologies. In essence, Boas is implying that the relationship between the United States government and indigenous peoples is one that is similar to the relationship between, for example, Great Britain and its colonies. In a word, a colonial relationship. In his response to Boas 10 days later, Rhodes expressed his intent on utilizing Boas's suggestions to further improve the system of carrying out a policy of assimilation, whereas Boas suggested that a turn to Indian college as a move away from assimilating Indians to be white citizens. In response, Rhodes rephrased Boas's appeal and advice regarding Indian policy to mean, quote, an effort to build on the Indians' own culture in continuing a program of assimilation. And this was opposed to Boas's tactful suggestion to encourage cultural persistence as a means to cope with the real politic of oppressive U.S. Indian policy and settler encroachment. And these are ideas that are all more explicitly expressed in Finney's political writings, many of which were never published, but they exist in the Finney papers. Boas wrote back to Rhodes on February 16, 1932, with hopes of impressing upon the commissioner the views of Finney. Boas says, "I am taking the liberty to send you, enclosed, a paper by Mr. Archie Finney, a Nez Perce Indian who has been with me for about 3 years and who I believe has good judgment in regard to the general situation." The ideas of Finney's draft manuscript sent to Rhodes are also in an article, published posthumously as "The Nimipoo Among the White Settlers." That's the title Finney gave to his treatise on U.S. Indian policy. The title of the manuscript is a compelling provocation and indictment of U.S. Indian policy, as well as settler encroachment, not as a mere historical problem, but as a contemporary one in Finney's time and for us still today. Finney places the Nimipoo among white settlers as a challenge and shift in perspective of the more commonly accepted and adventurous, if not romantic, notion of what they refer to as the white anthropologist or adventurer among the tribe. It accentuates the sense of being surrounded and closed in on by the settlers. A number of pertinent points Finney argued continue to be of direct importance and relevance to colonialism in North America today and Indian policy in both Canada and the United States. Yet it's Finney's acute critique, tempered by a sensitive and nuanced appreciation of the colonial pressures and this hopelessness that Boas referred to, that compel us to understand how Boas identified with and tried to carry forward Finney's political views to those responsible for U.S. Indian policy. Finney's treatise begins with a direct statement on the Dawes Allotment Act, mainly how its function by design was to dissolve sovereignty while absolving the United States of any treaty obligations. Second, Finney delineated how the Nimipoo had become agency Indians, a new class of land-poor Indians, and the consequence of these upon Indian life. Third, there was no question of the veracity of the importance of this treaty relationship to the Nimipoo. Moreover, Finney, who worked for the U.S. government, also understood the U.S. government's distorted view of the treaty relationship. He says, "These claims against the government for treaty violations by the whites in the early years of the reservation have been the liveliest issue before the Indians for a score of years. It is not surprising that a judicial organ of the federal government in reviewing these cases must have only one eye on the justice and validity of Indian claims, because the other eye is on the financial interests and Indian policy of the U.S. government. The government has not chosen simply to deny in one sweeping action all the numerous claims of U.S. Indian tribes. It has preferred to disallow each claim separately, and thus to keep each issue alive through long years of expensive adjudication. Thus, the Nimipoo have clung to their hopes for reimbursement by the government." And that's the end of that quote. What ties Finney's complex analysis of the Nimipoo political context in relation to U.S. Indian policy together is the treaty relationship between the Nimipoo and the federal government, a relationship that was perceived by them to be both legal and moral. Their hopes were and remain invested in this relationship and the recognition of the injustices the U.S. government had exercised in violating this treaty through its own policies of allotments and assimilation. On March 17, 1933, 1 month before John Collier would officially be appointed Indian Commissioner, Boas wrote to Roosevelt in a tactful attempt to influence the course of U.S. Indian policy. Boas began by detracting from the policy of assimilation and the notion of institutionalizing the Indian into a white citizen, and those are his words, while emphasizing the ongoing importance of what he referred to as old ways. Boas then pointed to the problem tied to the duties of being an Indian commissioner, who he said is hampered by the imposition of old laws. Next, he advised against John Collier's appointment as Indian commissioner, which is on the surface really surprising, given Collier's altogether radically socialist slant and his anti-assimilation politics. Instead, Boas advocated the appointment of two kinds of persons: a legal expert who would, in his words, safeguard the legal status of the Indian and change laws detrimental to the Indian, and another person who not only understands Indians, but how their conditions are affected by contact with what Boas referred to as modern life. By legal status, Boas means their relationship with the U.S. federal government, that is, the treaty relationships and the obligations that the U.S. government must fulfill. The emphasis Boas put on actionable reforms within and through the government excluded recommendations that suggested further reforms directly on Indigenous communities. The policies were constantly changing, and communities constantly have to adjust. Instead, the impetus to implement just and moral reforms lay, in Boas's view, on the U.S. government and not on Indigenous peoples, who, as Finney demonstrated, continue to live in accordance with the treaty relationship. In response to Collier's requests for anthropological consultation on how to proceed with reversing allotment and implementing changes in Indian policy, Boas writes another tactful letter on December 7th, 1933. He qualifies his recommendations of Ella Deloria, who was, in his words, unusually qualified, and Archie Finney, who was still in Russia but was studying the problem and has already written a position paper on the situation. Boas suggested there is one who could perform the job well and proceeded to recommend, no one who could perform the job well and proceeded to recommend an educational program for Indian educators in order to assist them with economic problems. Moreover, he suggested that physicians and nurses require a better understanding of what the Indians need. On this point, Boas was clear that, quote, scientific anthropology is not as important as an understanding of Indian needs. Ultimately, this suggestion by Boas was intended to clear the way for non-academically trained persons to be involved, such as Indigenous persons who intimately understand their problems in ways no one else can, but otherwise would not have had the required credentials to work for the government. Second, Boas tied the significance of tribal cohesion and the importance of their social traditions to the necessity of dismantling what he called the factory standardized education policy. Indian education for Boas should be particular to each community and based upon each community's specific cultural tradition and political goals as they articulated them. Moreover, Boas was thinking relationally in arguing that, quote, the education of each particular group ought to be adjusted in such a way that they can become a connecting link between the tribe and the white population. Third, he reiterated the problem from another angle and reinforced the importance of encouraging Indian cultures in young persons as a means for them to overcome their, quote, sense of inferiority and ultimately their hopelessness. Altogether, these anti-colonial positions articulated by Finney's but carried forward by Boas in an attempt to affect the course of U.S. Indian policy in the 1930s, while addressing some of the most pertinent challenges of decolonization still today. Before I conclude, I want to draw attention to the significance of Finney's and Boas's work. Finney's and Nez Perce texts are more than text, but living stories that carry forward their own laws despite the imposition of what some people could consider settler law. Boas knew this in his own way, and their problem, their anthropological problem, which is our problem today, is expressed by action anthropologist Saul Tax in this way. He says, I ask myself how government and law made by and for persons of another culture, essentially mutualist, like that of the American Indians. If you consult Finney's texts, you would find out that water permeates the myths and history of the Nez Perce people. According to these texts, Finney's texts note the tribal legend from which the monster whose girth filled the arid plateau between the Cascade Range and the Bitterroot Mountains before the time of Indians lay dead through the devices of Coyote. His deed done, Coyote washed his hands, and with the wash water bloody he sprinkled the land. The Nez Perce, a powerful people, grew from the water and settled the Clearwater River country of Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. In 2004, Anthony D. Johnson of the Nez Perce Tribal Executive Committee testified before Congress at a hearing of the Snake River Water Rights Act. Citing the Nez Perce text, he said, simply put, Nez Perce people defined themselves in terms of their associations with and relationship to fish and water. In March 2005, the Nez Perce Tribal Executive Committee agreed to waive in-stream reserved water rights claims for salmon through the Snake River Basin in a settlement with the federal government, state of Idaho, and Idaho water users. These claims arose from treaties signed by the Nez Perce and federal government in 1855 and 1863, which exterminated Aboriginal title to millions of acres in Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, but also explicitly reserved fishing rights for tribal members on and off the Nez Perce Reservation in north central Idaho. These texts by Archie Finney and also Boaz's students such as Ella Deloria, those literatures and those stories that are also contain the languages stand today as powerful texts that can be brought forward to understand more about Indigenous law and how Indigenous law can inform non-Indigenous peoples like myself about how to live relationally on those lands. And I think a lot of that is in the documents between Finney and Boaz and this exchange of relationships between them that we can learn a lot from today. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks to Joshua and Ian for organizing this session, and to everyone on the Franz Boas Papers Project for including me in this great project, and thank you all for coming today. For those of us interested in traditional Sioux culture, history, and language, the legacy of Yankton ethnographer and linguist Ella Cara Deloria is enormous. Here I use Sioux as a cover term to refer to the Dakota, Yankton, Yanktone, and Lakota peoples collectively. In this paper, I explore Deloria's immense contribution to ethnographic studies of the Sioux and her complex and productive relationship with Franz Boas, who needs no introduction here. Trained and guided by Boas, Deloria was a Boasian par excellence, and the quality of her work and its continuing relevance speaks to the enduring value of the Americanist tradition, as discussed by Regna Darnell in her classic Invisible Genealogies, A History of Americanist Anthropology. Deloria's interests, like the distinctive features of the Americanist tradition, focused on the intersections of cultural anthropology, history, and linguistics among American Indian peoples. Boas's undeniable influence is reflected in Deloria's theory, method, and practice, particularly her lifelong commitment to participant observation fieldwork and the Boasian text tradition. In so many ways, Ella epitomizes the very best of the Americanist tradition in anthropology. Ella Cara Deloria was born January 31st, 1889 on the Yankton Sioux Indian Reservation in southeastern South Dakota. Her Indian name was Beautiful Day Woman, Ampetu Washtewi. Her father was Reverend Philip Deloria, an Episcopal priest, and her mother was Mary Sully Bordeaux, both enrolled members of the Yankton Sioux tribe and descendants of Dakota and Euro-American ancestors. Ella was the firstborn daughter in a prominent mixed-blood Episcopal family, and her status as an Ieska, that is, a mixed blood or interpreter, an intermediary or insider-outsider, and culture broker, would continue into her professional career as a native anthropologist. Ella's ancestry vividly illustrates the two conflictual worlds within which she moved. Her Dakota grandfather was Francois Sasway Deloria, a Yankton chief and powerful medicine man. Her white grandfather was Brigadier General Alfred Sully, a career Indian fighter, perhaps best known for his role in the harsh reprisals for the Dakota conflict in Minnesota in 1862, culminating in the Battle of Whitestone Hill in September 1863, in which U.S. troops under Sully's command destroyed a village of some 500 lodges of Dakota, Yankton, and Lakota people, including many women and children. These people were Sully's own affinal relatives and later Ella's people. A year after Ella's birth, her family moved to Wakpala on the Standing Rock Reservation in north-central South Dakota. The Lakota people there were speakers of the L dialect of the Sioux language, rather than the D dialect spoken by the Yanktons. Thus, Ella, although a Yankton, grew up speaking Lakota. As the eldest child, Ella became the inheritor of many family traditions and was acquainted with many of the elders at both Standing Rock and Yankton reservations, learning firsthand from them the old Sioux ways. After Ella's death, her famous nephew, Vine Deloria Jr., recalls, quote, "In her belongings, I found a picture of the people at Wakpala sitting on the hillside, watching a fast train speed through the reservation. It is dated 1903, when Ella was just reaching adolescence, and I suspect she was the photographer, recording behavior even at that early age," end quote. Ella was schooled at St. Elizabeth's Mission in Wakpala until 1902, when she began attending All Saints School, an Episcopal boarding school in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Ella attended Oberlin College in Ohio before transferring to Columbia Teachers College in New York City in 1913, where she earned her Bachelor of Science degree in Physical Education in 1915. Although she lacked formal academic qualifications in ethnology and linguistics, Deloria met Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict in her senior year at Columbia. This fortuitous twist of fate led to her attending classes taught by Boas and Benedict in anthropology, folklore, linguistics, and research methods, and would eventually blossom into a productive relationship between Deloria and Boas, and ultimately, Deloria's reputation today as the most prolific native scholar of the Lakotas. When Boas first met Deloria at Columbia, he was intrigued by her fluency in the Sioux language. In fact, Ella was fluent in all three dialects. For Boas, Deloria was the fulfillment of a long search to find a native speaker who could help him in his studies of the Sioux language. Boas personally trained Ella in the study of American Indian languages and culture, setting in motion the course of much of the rest of her life. In 1927, after losing touch for a number of years, Boas learned of Deloria's whereabouts and visited her at Haskell Institute in Lawrence, Kansas, to propose that she resume her studies of Lakota language and culture. Deloria readily agreed, writing to Boas on Christmas Day in 1927, quote, "I want you to know that I would rather do this work on the Dakota than anything else," end quote. Thus began the rest of Ella's life as an ethnographer and linguist, a recorder, translator, and sender of words, as well as the extremely productive, influential, and mutually beneficial collaboration and genuine friendship between Boas and Deloria that would last until Boas's death in 1942. Ella's early work with Boas focused on Sioux language, checking the accuracy and translations of the George Bush Otter text and the missionary Stephen Riggs' Dakota Dictionary. Among the fundamental tenets of the Americanist tradition are the related ideas that native language texts are the appropriate database for anthropological interpretation, and that the study of Native American languages is the ideal entree into Native thought and worldview. It should come as no surprise that Deloria's exemplary anthropology was a reflection of Boas and the Americanist tradition. This is meant in no way to detract from Ella's unique gifts and abilities as an ethnographer and linguist. Aside from training her, Boas also directed much of Ella's research, proposing that she record, quote, "all the details of everyday life, as well as of religious attitudes and habits of thought of the people," end quote. Although Boas planned to work collaboratively with Deloria on the Sioux language, the initial project for which she was hired was psychological in nature, the creation of a culture-free IQ test to dispel myths concerning the correlation of race and IQ. Boas facilitated research by finding funds to support it and helped design many of the projects carried out by his students. So Ella's initial research design is no exception. In a letter dated January 26, 1928, Boas outlined the research design of the project to Deloria. Quote, "The primary objective of the investigation is a critical study of the psychological tests by which it has been claimed racial differences can be established. In our opinion, it seems not unlikely that the cultural conditions under which the individual grows up and lives have a far-reaching effect upon any kind of test that may be made," end quote. Working with psychologist Otto Kleinberg, Deloria developed a special Sioux IQ test involving beadwork, administering it to both Sioux and white children in South Dakota. Sure enough, the Sioux children fared much better on the test than did their white counterparts. From 1928 to 1938, with support from Boas and Columbia University, Deloria studied Sioux language, recorded stories, and ethnographic material from Lakota elders throughout South Dakota, and translated historical texts written by tribal members. From 1939 until Benedict's unexpected death in 1948, Deloria continued to work as time and finances allowed on the materials she had collected. Throughout her life, Ella's work and mission was often compromised by family responsibilities and financial hardship. Deloria's life as an anthropologist was largely nomadic and unfortunately often unshika, an important Lakota concept meaning pitiful or humble. Throughout various periods of in her life, she lived in her car and carried with her only a handful of possessions that were dear to her. Among these precious belongings were two photographs, one of her father, the Reverend Philip Deloria, and the other of her mentor, Franz Boas. Deloria respected and admired the charismatic Boas for his integrity and scholarship. In a letter congratulating him on his 81st birthday, Deloria writes, quote, "I would not trade the privilege of having known you for anything I can think of," end quote. Ella looked to Boas as a father figure, much like the rest of Boas's students, some of whom affectionately referred to him as Papa Franz. Deloria referred to Boas as Father Franz, acknowledging the closeness of their relationship but marking her respect, much like she would in addressing her Sioux elders and respect relatives. Indeed, Boas's intellectual genealogy was and continues to be based on kinship, much like the fabric of the societies typically studied by Americanist anthropologists. When Ella addressed Boas, the prototypical Jewish scholar, as Father Franz, he would respond by saying, "Ella, you make me feel like a Catholic priest." Deloria would reply, "Next to my own father, you are the most truly Christian man I ever met." Towards the end of her life, when she was living in poverty in Vermilion, South Dakota, Deloria spoke to a group of women about her career in anthropology. When the topic of her late mentor came up, Deloria said, quote, "Dr. Boas is a great anthropologist. He's dead now, and he was at Columbia, and he really started the general interest in anthropology, and he was a great man," end quote. According to Lakota anthropologist B. Medicine, the picture of Boas continued to be a fixture in Ella's Unshika hotel room in Vermilion, and she treasured it until her death in 1971. The relationship between Boas and Deloria, despite the unequal power dynamics undoubtedly linked to Ella's role as a Native woman without a PhD in pre-World War II academia, was in many ways mutually beneficial and dependent. In a letter of recommendation written in July 1937, Boas comments that Ella's knowledge of the Sioux is unique. Margaret Mead recalls that Boas had a deep respect for and dependence upon Ella, and in a letter from Boas to Benedict in November 1930, Boas states frankly, quote, "I cannot afford to lose her services just now," end quote. Many additional examples of high praise for Ella and her work could be given. Although Ella's work with Boas was steady, it hardly offered a stable salary with any sense of security. Boas gave Ella her first paycheck, and he did his best to support her financially, occasionally at his own expense, opening his home to her on at least one occasion. Boas raised funds from an array of sources to support Ella's work, with few gaps from 1928 until his death in 1942. Deloria earned between $100 and $200 a month, or roughly $1,400 to $2,700 by today's standards. Out of this meager salary, basically amounting to a graduate student's income, Deloria was expected to pay for all her transportation and field expenses. According to those who knew her best, Ella was always short of funds to support herself and her sister Susan. Throughout her life, Ella had to take on much of the burden of family leadership. She was trapped by family responsibilities, again caught between two conflicting worlds, one focused on traditional kinship and generosity, and the other on individual achievement and the accumulation of wealth. Ella was like a mother to her younger siblings, and throughout her life, she cared for her sister Susan, who suffered from brain problems. Susan was Ella's closest companion, but also hampered her career goals and financial stability. The last years of Ella's life were spent at the University of South Dakota in Vermilion, where she served as assistant director of the W.H. Over Museum doing work on the Sioux dialects. She was also compiling a Santee Sioux dictionary through grant funding. Ella's work with her people continued until her death at Wagner, South Dakota on February 12, 1971. Like Boas, she felt a great urgency to record and document Sioux language and culture in the face of unparalleled culture change. Up until her last days, Ella continued to make trips to the reservations to work collaboratively with elders who still remembered the old language and culture. This was even into her 60s and 70s. Ella's contribution is enormous and can be measured in various ways. Here I focus on her contributions as they align with the fundamental features of the Americanist tradition. Ella inherited a cognitivist, symbolic approach to culture from Boas, and a focus on the collaborative interpretation of meaning based both on observed behavior and its explication in words. Her lifelong commitment to participant observation fieldwork led to the production of a number of ethnographic and ethnohistorical manuscripts, many of which remain unpublished. These include The Dakota Way of Life, which Ray DeMalley describes as, quote, a cultural description in a Boasian sense, an idealized and generalized synthesis of the past, a testament to the old and valued customs of the Sioux, end quote. Speaking of Indians, a popular book first published in 1944 to promote cross-cultural understanding of Indian people, a large corpus of unpublished ethnographic materials relating to all aspects of traditional Sioux life and culture, and the classic Water Lily, a historical novel published posthumously, which has become a bestseller for the University of Nebraska Press. In terms of the Boasian text tradition and Americanist emphasis on language as symbolic form, Deloria was no less prolific. The Boasian program committed the student to produce a grammar, a dictionary, and text for each language and culture studied. Deloria recorded, transcribed, and translated an enormous body of Sioux language texts on topics including traditional myths, anecdotes, autobiographies, political speeches, conversation, humorous stories and aphorisms, including commentaries on dictionaries and translation of large text collections by George Bushotter and George Sword, who were Lakota, and Jack Frazier, a Santee Dakota person. A written record of such magnitude and diversity does not exist for any other Plains Indian language, and we have Ella Deloria to thank for that. Deloria published an article based on Sword's Lakota Sundance account in the Journal of American Folklore in 1929, and the classic Dakota text in 1932. Boas and Deloria co-authored an article in the International Journal of American Linguistics in 1933 titled Notes on the Dakota Teton Dialect, and the classic Dakota Grammar in 1941, to this day the best reference grammar of the Sioux language. Deloria also developed a Lakota lexicon and Santee dictionary. In 1943, Ella received the Indian Achievement Award from the Indian Council Fire in Chicago, at that time the most prestigious award a Native American could receive. Further, countless scholars from anthropology to history to Native American studies have benefited from Ella's masterful field notes and linguistic work. And a significant body of contemporary literary criticism and feminist scholarship has also taken shape around her life and work. Indeed, Ella Deloria was much more than, quote, an insightful and hardworking key informant, end quote, as she has been described. She was an anthropologist of the highest caliber in her own right, even though she humbly didn't consider herself as such, as she confessed to Boas in 1935. While Ella was content to call herself a linguist, perhaps her reluctance to identify as a full-fledged anthropologist in the same category as Boas, Benedict, and Meade is tied to her embeddedness in Lakota culture, which honors humility as a core value. In many ways, Deloria was what we would call an activist, a spokeswoman for her people, cultural mediator and interpreter between cultures. Ella wrote for the survival of her people, that the people may live as the Lakota expression goes. The dedication that is apparent in Deloria's quest to preserve traditional Sioux language and culture was rooted in her concern for the future of her people. It is my sincere hope that we, as the inheritors of the Americanist tradition in anthropology, will always acknowledge and appreciate Ella Cara Deloria and her contribution as a unique, influential, and exceedingly prolific member of our intellectual genealogies. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. So I'm going to start by having trouble. My name's Ian Pepe. I'm postdoc working with Boas Papers. And I thought that it would be important, since my work is a bit of an outlier in this project, to situate my research and interest in the Boas Papers in order to show what kinds of scholarship these documents make possible. I thought it would be important as well because Boas isn't my primary interest, but rather one link in a chain of disciplinary, theoretical, and methodological development that's come to be known as anthropology. Perfect. My interest in the history of anthropology is tied directly to my interest in Algonquin Provincial Park, the Kitchissippi or Ottawa River Valley, and the Algonquin Nation or Omamo-Inini. When I first began my explorations of the archives and ethnographic literature on the area, the name of Frank Speck jumped out again and again as the first and sometimes only ethnographer to have visited many of the communities that I was concerned with. And so my interest in the Boas Papers comes through my interest in exploring Speck's involvement with the Algonquin. And beyond this, my research has motivated me to begin deconstructing the dismissive attitude towards salvage ethnography prevalent in much contemporary scholarship, and to examine more closely what those who undertook such scholarship thought they were up to. My materials so far in this project consist of works by and about Boas, Speck, and others, the digitized correspondences between the two contained in the Boas Papers held by the American Philosophical Society, and oral histories, or what Regna Darnell has described as corridor talk, critical to the history of anthropology as she imagines and practices it. As she states, anthropologists gossip about one another and consequently rethink, sometimes painfully, their everyday experience. The Boas Papers have helped me to understand that some ethnographers imagined their primary audience to consist of scholars, academics, and other elites, while some others were more concerned with collaboration and recording what would benefit the people with whom they undertook their work and with whom they identified. Speck, for his part, seems to have taken the latter track, following Boas in some important ways in archiving and documenting what he could find and reconstruct of cultures and languages seemingly under threat. Rarely angry in public, quote, if his indignation was over the treatment of the American Indian, Speck could breathe fire. For example, through Speck's emotional intervention in defense of the land rights of the Six Nations of the Iroquois near Brantford, Ontario, the Canadian government ultimately withdrew a bill to amend the Canadian Indian Land Act, according to his grandson Blankenship. Quoting Fenton, no academic appointment, no learned gathering, no university functions took precedence over the visit of an Indian colleague, the summons to an Indian council, or the call to attend a ceremony. Speck did not covet academic honors. Rather, he valued the good opinion of his Indian friends. When Speck arrived at Columbia University, he shared with his mentor in comparative linguistics, John Dinelly Prince, a love for the study of language, but more unusually, he arrived with knowledge of 2 Native American languages that had supposedly fallen out of use. The details of how he learned these smatterings of Pequot Mohegan and Delaware Mohican remain unclear. However, the Speck family retained a nanny for young Frank Jr., Mrs. Gussie Giles, who hailed from the Gullah Islands off the coast of Virginia and the Carolinas, who was of mixed African and Native ancestry, and who may have spoken an Algonquin language. Young Speck was also sent at the age of 8 to live with a family friend, Miss Fidelia Fielding, who was of Pequot heritage and who sent him home with several notebooks, diaries, letters, and transcripts, as well as a working knowledge of the Pequot, Mohegan, and Delaware languages, and a sense of solidarity with his Native contemporaries. His student, John Witoff, points out that the Fieldings and the Specks remained in contact since the time when the Indian communities of coastal New England and New York had played major roles in whaling and shipping, and when Frank's ancestors, both Indian, Mohican, and Dutch, sailed from the Hudson River ports. It was Prince who introduced Speck to Boas, who shared both an interest in languages and Native North America, but also in natural history. Speck had published papers on toads and other reptiles before coming to Columbia, and later continued his work in natural history by undertaking early ethnozoological, ethnobotanical, ethnoornithological, and ethnoherpetological studies, as well as becoming involved in the formation of ethnohistorical methods long before studies of cognition were fashionable. These shared interests became the grounds for long-term alliance between the two men. Speck and his students staunchly defended Boas against the attacks of eugenicists such as Charles Benedict Davenport. Boas was often attacked for his ideas during the 2 Great Wars, and occasionally became the target of detractors simply because of his Jewish heritage. So there was a more personal connection as well in their mutual recognition of one another's mixed ethno-racial ancestry, and their shared contention that this mixedness held no sway over mental prowess or potential. But Speck seems to have had another motivation in his efforts at salvage ethnography that was perhaps even more intense. After working on the materials that Ms. Fielding had provided him, he began work on other groups and languages and sent the archive to his mentor Prince. As senility and sadness had set in, visits to Mrs. Fielding had become more difficult and less frequent for Frank, who saw her as a mother figure. Prince stored the documents in his house for a time, continuing the work until the documents were consumed in a blaze that leveled the building. Speck was devastated, according to his student Witoft, and refused to work on further Algonquian materials for a while, even after receiving 2 more previously misplaced diaries from Fielding's son after her death. When he did return to Algonquian studies, he targeted his efforts towards recovering the remaining vestiges of language and material culture from often overlooked communities, and this pattern was to continue until his death in 1950. Fenton states that of all the students of Franz Boas, Speck was the greatest and most persistent field worker. But with the destruction of Ms. Fielding's papers, he became even more focused on recording what he could from these communities before memories were lost. Only remaining in Philadelphia when classes were in session, Speck spent the majority of his summers and time away from the university visiting communities as far afield as Louisiana, Oklahoma, and northern Labrador. Speck always maintained a friendly and respectful attitude to and about Boas, but eventually something simple and more ironic seems to have driven a slight wedge between the two men. In a letter dated February 17, 1933, Speck writes, "It seems that our correspondence is all of so strictly a business nature that I do not have occasion to say how much I'm pleased to hear from time to time that you are well and active, and I seem to be so constantly occupied with increased duties here that my visits to New York are so infrequent that I feel almost cut off from contact with you. Nevertheless, this letter conveys my sincere best wishes." The response from Boas is telling. The next day he writes, "I'm sorry I have not seen you for such a long time. You always run away on your vacations, so that there's hardly a chance of ever seeing you." The wistful and sentimental feel of the words is obvious to me, but there's also a less forgiving note in Boas' reference to Speck's fieldwork as vacations, insinuating that Speck's trips to places such as Martha's Vineyards, the Hamptons, and elsewhere in search of Indians were of perhaps less value than Speck thought. What had first endeared Speck to Boas now frustrated their relationship. Anthony Wallace, Speck's student, recounts how they were still undertaking fieldwork in Delaware in 1948 with, quote, "the Nanticoke Indians, who have never enjoyed reservation status and have for perhaps 2 centuries maintained an awkward and ambiguous ethnic identity. A local Nanticoke Indian Association had developed and was exerting political pressure with some success to improve things educationally, and Speck gave direct aid and comfort in this effort. The fieldwork itself also contributed indirectly to the goal of recreating an Indian ethnic identity by recapturing information about Aboriginal culture from the observation of contemporary practice, much of it more recognizably Indian to Speck than it was to the Nanticoke themselves. Speck understood this awkward and ambiguous identity, as Wallace puts it, as he shared the same self-perception. As another of his students, A.I. Hallowell, said, Speck's self-involvement with the study people and their problems was perhaps greater than that of other anthropologists of the period. Speaking of traditionalists at the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, Speck says, quote, "The devotee has somehow fortified his inner spirit against most of the cheap ideas and untried innovations of an age of perplexities and hypocrisies in religious teaching, alien to his tradition. This condition, lamentable perhaps to missionaries and teachers, employed in the vanguard of an overtense civilization, has indeed been a felicity to the ethnologist, no less than a guarantee to their national life." His effort to identify with the people and their problems and his desire to make a difference in the lives of those with whom he worked set him apart from many of his contemporaries. But in his avoidance of theoretical generalizations in favor of historical particularism, Speck's approach to applied ethnography and fieldwork was in part made possible by his encounter with Boas. While the term cultural relativism may not have been coined by either Speck or Boas, it does seem fair to give his mentor credit as he sets out the plan in an article from 1887. Quote, "Civilization is not something that is absolute. It is relative, and our ideas and conceptions are true only so far as our civilization goes." Dr. Speck received a communication one evening from a friend who needed something. This friend was worried about a relation who was ill and in need of medicine. The friend asked Dr. Speck if he could help, and Speck obliged. Calling on one of his trusted graduate students, Dr. Speck and his co-conspirator made their way to the only place that they knew they could find what they were looking for. The graduate student stood at the gates, keeping watch and staying ready to warn the good doctor should anyone come. Dr. Speck climbed the fence and made his way into the pen. After a short struggle, he emerged with their sought-out bounty. The wall had not gone smoothly. The two had been asked if they could help find a turtle, which would be used to make a sacred rattle capable of curing the illness. The first place that Dr. Speck thought to find such a specimen was the Philadelphia Zoo. So the two had gone after the zoo's closing, broken in and absconded with a very large snapping turtle, unwilling to go without a fight, as snappers are wont to do. And Dr. Speck had incurred a flesh wound, but the turtle had to be delivered quickly. The doctor and his student sped to their destination, and after delivering the turtle to the one who requested it, Dr. Speck made his own request. Bleeding heavily from a long gash in his arm, Dr. Speck asked one of the experts in Aboriginal medicines if he could be looked after. The healer performed his practice and sang him some songs. Speck sought culturally appropriate treatment for a wound suffered during a ceremonial harvest. Not only did he accept the validity of the Aboriginal healer's knowledge and authority, he gave that knowledge priority over biomedicine in its cultural context, a revolutionary approach for the time and a decision taken at great personal risk. It would seem that this was nothing new for the good doctor, though. Taking his native friends and collaborators at their word was exemplary of his ethnographic approach and his personal affectation, and further evidence of this can be found in his defense of the Aboriginal derivation of the family hunting territory. In seminal Americanist debates, Eleanor Leacock and others argued from a Marxist perspective that Algonquian family hunting territories were acculturated innovations accomplished post-contact by ethnically mixed peoples. Speck understood these debates on different terms. The evolutionist legacy of these debates still haunts the discipline of anthropology, leading many to disregard the work of predecessors such as Speck, who claimed to practice salvage ethnography based on the misplaced assumption that these salvagers expected Aboriginal cultures to die off due to the pressures of modernity, and that they were interested in pronouncing this apocalypse. In Speck's case, this assumption is anachronistically misinformed. For example, Midwinter writes of the Cayuga Longhouse shows a profound solidarity with whom he worked. Importantly for my work and for the Algonquin Nation, Speck mapped out the hunting territories of the unrecognized Algonquin communities living at Mattawa, Temiskaming, Temagami, and Kitaganzibi, or River Desert near Maniwaki, Quebec. And his defense of the Aboriginality of these hunting territories came at a time when the federal and provincial governments were negotiating the Williams Treaty, formally settled in 1925, with Ojibwa and Chippewa from Rama and the shores of Georgian Bay. It would seem that rather than challenge Speck and his allies openly, the originally proposed territory of the settlement was renegotiated to exclude land near North Bay and Mattawa. A quietly drawn-up proposal to expand Algonquin Provincial Park northward was just as quietly withdrawn at about the same time that Speck arrived. The Algonquins still assert that they have never been party to a formal treaty with the Canadian government, and therefore have not ceded their land or their rights to it. This is critical because recently rare earth mineral prospecting has been undertaken on territory near Kippawa, between Eagle Village and Wolf Lake, without consultation with the local Aboriginal authorities. This is territory mapped by Speck almost 100 years ago. Speck didn't argue theoretically. He simply demonstrated the historical jurisdiction and contemporary presence of his Algonquin collaborators. Merci, miigwech. Thank you.
My gratitude to Josh and Ian for organizing this panel, and my colleagues on the panel here, and my whole Franz Boas project, Franz Boas Papers Project team, long word. My name is Sarah Moritz, and the title of my talk is From Baffinland to the Northwest Coast via Berlin, Franz Boas, Friedrich Ratzel, Adolf Bastian, and the development of an ecological approach for ethnography. In Berlin during the 1880s, Franz Boas came under the influence of prevailing scientific discussions around Arctic sciences and geography, including German ethnology, or Völkerkunde, as they say. These included leading German scientists such as Theobald Fischer, Hermann Wagner, Moritz Lindemann, and Friedrich Ratzel in geography and polar science, Rudolf Virchow and Ernst Haeckel in physical anthropology, ecology, zoology, and evolution, Hermann von Helmholtz in physics, and Adolf Bastian in ethnography and ethnology. And today I will just introduce a few key elements in the impact these had on Boas's early career in intellectual development. Boas was particularly influenced by Friedrich Ratzel's seminal Anthropogeography, Anthropogeography, with Volume 1 published in 1882 and Volume 2 published in 1891. The concept, a neologism, was offered by Ratzel to highlight the significance of humans in the physical environment. In the 1880s, this was referred to as a progressive new approach, as moderne Geographie or modern geography, a science that examines the relationship between Mensch und Erde oder Umwelt, humans and earth or environment, period. As a particular manifestation of environmental determinism, it proposed that the relationship of groups with their environment produced specific cultural traits. That is, habitat was crucial in bringing about cultural diversity. Similarities between cultural groups were explained as occurring due to geographical diffusion of cultural traits by migrating groups, and human cultural evolution emerged out of territorial competition between migrating groups. This theory influenced a perspective that viewed humans as limited by their habitat and their potential range of responses, a perspective that holds that human culture is fundamentally shaped by environmental conditions. The environment in this view was postulated to cause changes in human societies, explaining human evolution through a mechanism of trait selection by the environment. In 1882, Friedrich Ratzel stressed that, quote, the fundamental theory of world history is the history of migration. This anthropogeography, to quote my colleague, geographer and Boas scholar Ludger Müller-Wille, became the scientific and methodological framework Boas adapted based on his fieldwork experience with the Inuit. For his field research among the Inuit, Boas had been interested in the investigation of the dependence of humankind on natural factors and the conditions of the natural environments. So Franz Boas to Marie Krakowitzer, then his fiancée. And while Boas did not use the concept and term ecology in these writings, in retrospect, this thematic and theoretical orientation may be described as the rudiments of cultural ecology, according to geographer and escapist anthropologist George Wenzel, or the beginnings of an ecological approach for anthropology and ethnography, since he was tackling the analysis of the involvement of people in their own social structure in relation to the natural environment. However, unlike a number of cultural ecologists that followed after Boas, who subscribed to distinct environmental determinist and or Eurocentric social evolutionist explanations, Boas sought to actively transcend these, and here's how. After a year in Baffinland during 1883 and 1884 for his Erstlingsreise, his first voyage to examine the, quote, elementary relationships between Inuit and the Arctic environment, Boas drafted the results of this exploration in a monograph representative of Ratzel's environmental or geographical determinism. Boas offered Baffinland geografische Ergebnisse einer in den Jahren 1833 und 1884 ausgeführten Forschungsreise. In short, results of Baffinland. As anthropo-geographical investigation combining formal descriptions of the physical geography of the area with an analysis of the relation of its inhabitants to their local surroundings. In a section titled Anthropo-Geography, Boas discussed population movements in relation to seasonal and geographical features, focusing on the interaction of various peoples of Baffinland and the diffusion of cultural traits. At this point, Boas faced obvious epistemological friction between the detailed topographic descriptions and historical insights he had gained from his anthropo-geographical investigations in Baffinland, and the general abstract laws he had sought in psychophysics and physics. In The Study of Geography, which Boas handed to N.D.C. Hodges, editor of Science, in January 1887, Boas systematically addressed these issues, questioning what he considered to be a materialistic Weltanschauung, which could be translated as a comprehensive conception or apprehension of the world from a specific standpoint. This, as Stocking reminds us, meant that his goals in the study of man and environment have been frequently described as the development of, quote, a physiological and psychological mechanics, as well as an attempt to see to what extent organic and psychic life may be grasped from a mechanistic point of view. The essential question for Boas became, was geography inductive? The inductive discipline of what the influential Prussian geographer Alexander von Humboldt coined cosmographer, concerned with the documentation and thorough understanding of individual phenomena as the outcome of specific historical processes within the cosmos, a thing of formal order and beauty, of both empiricism and imagination, and of the universality of created things constituting the perceptible world? Or was it that of the physicist whose goal was the deduction of general laws that govern the physical world, in which case individual phenomena had no intrinsic value and merely served as a means to discover abstract laws? Reminiscent of Immanuel Kant, Karl Ritter, and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Boas realized that the cosmographer followed the effective impulse of studying an individual phenomenon regardless of, quote, its place in a system and as, quote, worthy of being studied for its own sake. The physicist, in contrast, was guided by the aesthetic desire to systematize the seemingly chaotic and confusing world, its forms and species. But since the two approaches had their respective origin in a, quote, different desire of the human mind, any choice between them would only reflect the mental disposition of the judge, and only a confession as to which impulse predominates. Boas, therefore, accepted both the affective and the aesthetic desires equally, recognizing that they implied different means toward the same end, and to, in his words, establish facts and to find the eternal truth. The field of geography for him was ultimately part of cosmography because it originated in the, quote, affective impulse as the desire to understand the phenomena of history of a country, of the whole earth, the home of mankind. Boas concluded that there is a scientific choice to be made as it, quote, depends upon the inclination of the scientist towards physical or cosmographical method, whether he studies the history of a whole earth or whether he prefers to learn that of a single country. During this period, in 1886, Boas also came under Adolf Bastian's immediate influence, engaged as assistant at the Royal Ethnographic Museum in Berlin. According to Rudolf Virchow, the museum provided materials for specialized study of the problem of adaptation of man to diverse environments, especially of Europeans to the tropics, a project promoted by the German Colonial Association. Adolf Bastian, or the father of all ethnographic studies, as Boas calls him in one of his letters, or more generally of modern ethnology in Germany, was trained in both medicine and the natural sciences. Following Alexander von Humboldt and geographer Karl Ritter again, Bastian sought to document the full diversity of human life through empirical research and direct observation. In his program for a Science of Man, Bastian sought to unite natural, historical, and philological traditions, linking the precise description of physical realities with a sensitivity toward cultural particularities and their individual historical trajectories. Bastian's aim was to integrate Alexander von Humboldt's effort to account for the entirety of the cosmos, that is, to quote Humboldt, nature in connection with man and the movements of society with language, economy, and exchange, institutions, and architecture, with an appreciation for each individual folk, relying on Herder and Wilhelm von Humboldt as a critical moment in the complexity of humanity. Because the right of existence of each group was severely threatened by colonial expansion and negative European impact upon traditional societies, Bastian and Salvage Mode regarded it paramount to collect as many ethnic materials as possible, including artifacts, myths, religious beliefs, grammars, or descriptions of political and economic systems. Addressing the urgency of salvage anthropology in his collecting mania, Bastian's theoretical framework was conceived in the spirit of the Humanitätsideal, the humanist ideal, uniting a sense of the universal with an appreciation of the particular aspects of humanity. It was based on two central concepts, the Elementargedanken, elementary ideas, and Völkergedanken, folk ideas, which he also defined as worldview. Bastian argued that a limited range of elementary ideas or elementary patterns of thought, constant through space and time, were common to all of humanity. These elementary ideas were always unique and expressed as folk ideas, the specific patterns of thought of particular groups. Developing from a limited number of elementary ideas, the distinct patterns of Völkergedanken or folk ideas among each people depended primarily on each group's environment. From this notion, he developed the concept of geographical province, in which a homogeneous environment conditioning a relatively uniform cultural setting produced similar folk ideas. But while folk ideas were primarily shaped by geographical factors, they were always susceptible to change through historical processes. Through, quote, transactions with neighbors, a people received new ideas which prompted new activities. The relative similarity of folk ideas around the world was thus confirmation of the psychic unity of mankind, because it, quote, exposed a monotonous substratum of identical elementary ideas. For Bastian, the primary task of ethnography was the collection of folk ideas, not of elementary ideas, as these were not directly discernible. At the museum, influenced by these notions, Boas's interest shifted further toward ethnology, the comparative and the ethnographic method to study human-environmental relationships. He abandoned the geographical determinism that had governed his first monograph. Its results he later called a thorough disappointment, since the immediate influence of the environment was patent and could not account for the driving forces that mold behavior. The Inuit he worked with turned out to be not at all primitive, as evolutionary science had dictated, but culturally sophisticated, well adjusted to a seemingly harsh environment, and just as richly complex in their Herzensbildung, or to use Friedrich Schiller's term, Bildung des Gemüts, that is inner character, as anybody else Boas lived, learned, and grew up with. Having concluded from his Arctic study that human behavior was not exclusively determined by geographical circumstances, but also by psychological and historical factors, Boas shifted his interest to the Northwest Coast, where he hoped to study their complex interrelation and interaction. He proposed an elaborate plan for a multi-year exploration ranging from Labrador to the Pacific Coast in an ambitious effort to develop his ethnographic approach. On January 5th, 1886, Boas sought Adolf Bastian's support through the following lines. And this is an excerpt. Quote, "Hochgeehrter Professor, you may remember that some time ago I offered to go on field trips in North America. At that time, you answered that if I would have to come to you with well-formulated and financially assured plans, you would be interested. At that time, you did not allow me to explain my plans, and I now take the liberty to give you a short resume. The object of my investigation were to be the so little known Indian and Eskimo tribes of the British Northwest. I wish to spend a summer, or for example winter, he puts in brackets, among Naskopi and Eskimos of Labrador, collecting and working with them. There's always much work to be done among them. A second summer I wish to spend among the completely unknown Eskimos of Chesterfield Inlet and the Western Indians, and then to visit the Alaskan tribes. In the fourth year, I should like to end with the Indians of Vancouver. My chief idea in this is that these tribes must be studied in relation to one another, and that only someone who understands the East will be able to thoroughly understand the West. I also mentioned to the committee that Jacobson's collections needed to be supplemented. For example, that all the masks could not be understood because we have no knowledge of others. And it remains ununderstandable without a knowledge of the peoples of west of Hudson Bay who can so easily be reached. I have tried, and I'm trying, to make my knowledge of value for science, but I can find no opportunity. That is why I'm again turning to you, father of all ethnographic studies, and ask for your assistance. If this attempt should fail, I think I shall have done my duty and will give up all further research activity. Without travel, I would not again make one isolated trip, but can only consider it worthwhile if the whole thing can be done as a related unit, as I've sketched out above. This request, as we may learn in correspondence, was denied by Bastian, which, as we can guess, did not actually stop young Boas, more to the contrary. With increasing attention to the Northwest Coast during the following years, Boas, however, did not abandon the Inuit or the geographic method that taught him so much about the ways to understand human-environmental relationships. Both are particularly obvious from Inuit and Northwest Coast materials and extensive maps Boas provides German geographical Justus Perthes publishers and chief editor Alexander Supan with. In conclusion, in a letter from Friedrich Ratzel to Franz Boas, June 8, 1897, Ratzel expresses respect for Boas's historicist counter-Enlightenment assertions in his recent address, The Limitations of the Comparative Method, of 1896. He concludes that Boas has now clearly adopted the inductive side, and this will be of great advantage for science. In this, Boas was questioning the construction of a grand system of the evolution of society as of very doubtful value because it ordered phenomena along the lines of a predetermined theory. To Boas, that method was fundamentally, quote, opposed to the inductive process by which the actual relations of definite phenomena may be derived. Ratzel epitomizes. You have always worked in this spirit, but it's fundamental that you rise to speak in this methodological conflict. Thank you.
Yeah. This is the one? To the left. Hi. Thank you, Josh, Regna, and the rest of our colleagues for organizing the session and for inviting me to participate in this great project on the Boas papers. I also want to thank Eddie Seitz, my collaborator on this project, who has been doing the brunt of the archival work in figuring out what to do with all this stuff that we have. And he just arrived from Cancun this morning and managed to negotiate the trip here. So caveat, tasked by Regna with Boas correspondence with Mexican scholars and institutions, our thinking is still developing as we continue to review and add materials while thinking about how to envision and shape this volume. Our talk is therefore a preliminary report, notes, and roving, perhaps rambling, you might think, ruminations on work in progress. The title does not so much define results as our anticipation, less an approach than a compass for a journey. So, that was my punchline. Let's go Mexico. The title, As Compass, points to the nation as a pervasive frame and metaframing of histories of anthropologies, and thus the way certain histories presuppose and recreate this lens with narratives that might fail to question the nation as context, frame, and condition of possibility. The historiography of Boaz often slides into such idolatry. For example, I feel in Stocking's story of Boaz. Similarly, the Mexican writing of the history of Mexican anthropology has also manifested this kind of idolatry, specifically in the form of a kind of hagiography of Manuel Gamio. In this now discredited but once dominant historiography, Gamio, as the cherished son of Boaz, is upheld as the one who professionalized the field, created a four-field disciplinary format, introduced the scientific method of stratigraphy, and established the paradigm of culture and cultural history in Mexican anthropology. Significantly, this historiography... It's on the... What happened to the... It's on the... Last time I did this presentation for Boaz, I spent 20 minutes playing with the technology. That's right. You gonna do that one? Okay. Let's see. It's should be right at the top of the list. So significantly, this historiography was mostly propagated by those Mexicans who shaped a post-revolutionary governmental anthropology in ways that needed to be loudly, if not actually, different than the preceding Porfirian anthropology. Thus, the idolatrous Mexican historiography narrated discontinuity with prior Mexican anthropology and continuity with Gamio and thus Boazian anthropology, while actually creating a governmental applied anthropology significantly different than the U.S. Boazian legacy. Of course, all this happened decades after the closure of the international school and the departure from Mexico of all those who were associated with it. Pointing north, our compass asks, how is it that the dominant histories of Boazian anthropology assert an entrenched and presupposed national frame of meaning on Boaz when he himself had such a deep disregard and a disinterest in the nation? So what? You're gonna? I'm gonna tell you to. Oh, okay. Pointing 17 degrees north, the compass asks, northwest, the compass asks, how is the nation both present and invisible to Boaz and his vision and practices of anthropology as discipline, theory, method, and institution building? The compass now points to August 11th, 1917, and this would be really ideal to have that slide up now. So you can read along with me. Go down. So this is our let's go. Let's see. The compass now points to August 11, 1917, when Boaz writes to his Mexican friend Ezequiel Chavez to protest his ignorance of the espionage work by Metschling and Mason about which he had just learned. Chavez replies in his August 17th letter, "My dear Mr. Boaz," interesting, knowing you the way I have the pleasure of doing, I would know very well that you are a stranger to all deceitful imagination. A system of secret conspiracies should produce within you, like in all the servers of the truth and therefore of liberty, a deep internal displeasure. Nevertheless, my dear friend, would you allow me to recommend prudence? Those passions which you and I condemn, that confuses the love for the nation with the love for humanity and the truth. The text is really awkward in Spanish, and I've done a little bit of tweaking. Interestingly, Chavez seems to answer an implicit question. Where is the proper place of the nation? Why can't the nation stay put and remain silent, be invisible in its proper place? He continues, the idolatry of the nations is placed above whoever exists, and especially above whatever is greater than it, liberty and justice. Chavez identifies a confusion of levels or slippage between frames that I think is fundamentally significant. The quote points to an awkward and speculative dynamic, a Cheshire cat appearance-disappearance of the nation, which I would argue might be found in everything having to do with what I'm going to call, for simplicity's sake, Boaz's Mexico moment. This slippage for me refers to the way that the nation is both seen and then not seen by Boaz and by others. For example, he is shocked to see nationalism distort science, the ethic and methods of science. He wishes it were invisible. At the same time, in his own identity formation, the national is hugely important. In private life, one can be or have nationalist motivations, but in the anthropological vocation of science, one must be a kind of post-national cosmopolitan, if you will, that does not put passion for the nation above truth, liberty, justice. Similarly, in his theoretical work, and please correct me on this, the nation is erased as a category of description. The nation is not a concept that he uses to define or analyzes the anthropological problems of culture, the kinds of descriptions that you were just describing about the theoretical frameworks of the objects, the folk, and so forth. Those Boaz's concept of culture and the theory of diffusion efface the nation as a frame and conditions of culture, as object of study. And yet culture concept and diffusion proposes in some sense the nation state as the perpetuator of the racial theories of evolution and the culture concept that he seeks to refute and combat, as we all know. What is Boaz's Mexico moment? I use this as shorthand that purposefully seeks to invoke the repeated reference to the espionage or censure episode that is the academic politics surrounding Boaz's revelation that anthropologists conducted covert espionage during World War I. Boaz's Mexico moment, however, is not a momentary flash in the pan, even though the most significant achievement, the International School of American Archaeology and Ethnology, only functioned for 4 years, from 1911 to 1914, when it was suspended but never officially closed. The International School is a kind of advanced I went the wrong way. I'm not conversant with Office 2013, 15, and 16. I don't know how to go forward, so I needed the next slide. Yeah, there you go, perfect. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. The International School was a kind of advanced field school to train advanced students in anthropology and to conduct research on problems defined by Boaz and the leadership that he sought to appoint. It was a school without degrees and funded through a variety of partner patrons, including national governments, U.S. universities, and museums who provided grants to the researchers. Representatives of these formed an executive board that appointed directors for 1 year and that gave 1-year grants for student researchers. The research projects were formulated as case studies. I think I use that phrase, paper, we can debate that. Case studies of problems related to the diffusion of culture in the Americas, culture history, origins of early man in the Americas, linguistics and language classifications, and the documentation of folklore. One might identify the start of the school as does Godoy, when Boaz enlists Columbia University President Butler in 1905 to initiate plans to create such an international school in Mexico, writing to Mexicans and other in the Prussian educational system. It might be earlier, and based on his interactions with Zelia Notal, who, following the 1893 Columbian Exposition. As Mexican historian Mechilde Ruch suggests, perhaps it began in Boaz's reflections on his international experience during the Jesup expedition, in which he says generated an internationalist vision for his agenda of anthropology building. When does the Mexico moment end? Perhaps the espionage and censure episodes of 1918 and 1920 mark the end of the Boaz Mexico moment. Perhaps not. Mexican archaeologist Leon Vasquez, puts the end earlier in 1917 when he asserts that archaeologists opposed to Gamio and Boaz, the ones who later created the narrative of a Boazian anthropology in Mexico, but created something different, when they came to power in Mexico's governmental anthropology and killed the possibility of resurrection of the school. Or maybe the end is when Boaz accepts the impossibility of reopening, when Gamio, his student and colleague, the last director of the school in 1917, is forced by Mexican politics into exile in the United States in 1925. The question of dates goes to the problem of conceptualization. The Mexico correspondence suggests that the volume should focus on the international school. Yet does the archive offer adequate materials for this task? The Mexican, 2 minutes. Next slide. That's a little bit of a history there. I want to then go, why isn't it not going forward? Okay.
Which slide do you need?
So I want to, the Mexican archive largely consists of correspondence with 3 persons, these 3 folks here. And I'm going to skip much of this about explaining what this details, what this correspondence pertains to. And I want to talk, oh, where did it go now? So together, these sets of letters provide a robust, detailed picture to reconstruct a thick history of the international school. Yet is this enough? In fact, while these sources are rich and varied and would create a wonderful volume, such a publication would not provide a comprehensive approach to either the international school nor Boas's relationship to Mexican anthropology. A volume based on this archive, on these materials, just discussed, would leave out, curiously enough, both the national context and the international processes. To present a more complete documentation of Boas's vision of and motivation for internationalizing anthropology, the volume that I would be editing with Eddie, perhaps, is the volume would have to include letters between Boas and Butler and Zelia Nuttall, if not the letters that Butler sent to Mexico, Prussia, and France to initiate the partnerships that established the international school. The actual processes, dynamics, achievements, frustrations, and politics of the international school would have to be enlarged by including the correspondence with all the other students, including minimally the U.S. students such as Clay, Metchling, Mason, as well as the Prussian Wagner. And Boas's correspondence with other members of the executive board, specifically Tauser and Seller, both of whom were also annual directors of the school, just as Enguerrand and Gamio. Indeed, although Enguerrand's letters go quite far in establishing the politics and machinations of the Mexican academic institutions, there's a significant gap in the record when we focus only on Boas's letters with those associated with the international school. These additions to the Mexico volume would triple the number of documents, including Tauser, Zeller, and so forth. And so I think that these correspondence, for example, with Woodward, Merriam, the 2 Merriams there, would be very important to understand this internationalizing approach that Boas is trying to achieve with international school, because it would give us some understanding of the context of the institutions. And I want to just leave you with this, because this is a segue for Sergi. This is a really opaque kind of letter, a comment that Boas writes to Enguerrand. Significantly, the whole condition of Mexico must, of course, be exceedingly distressing. The United States, by their policy, are not by any means helping matters. If we learn at all from historical events, I think we must recognize that under a state of disorder such as prevails at present, only a strong hand can bring relief, a Cromwell, a Napoleon, or a Diaz. Very interesting, right? The one thing that I do not understand is that the long oppression of the small communities by the unruly elements has not given a strong impetus to the movement for self-defense, which has begun a couple of years ago, but which does not seem to have led anywhere. So for me, this quote here points to a kind of lack of understanding of the nation and its role, and of course, the fact that he tried to create a school in the middle of a war. The Civil War, Mexican Revolution, is quite interesting. And so the kind of understanding of this process that's represented here is really kind of something that would require a lot of discussion, I think. But I would like to end there. Thank you so much, and sorry for the technology issues.
Now, I will be merciful. I don't have any slides, PowerPoints, or any of that rigmarole. My paper does deal with Boas and politics, So it does dovetail with Kitzels very nicely. And I think it further illustrates that wise as Boaz was and beloved by us, his descendants, he was also at times naive and plain wrong. So my paper is called Setting the Record Straight, Boaz, Soviet Russia, and the Communist Party, USA. It comes out of two streams of my work. One is a specific project, of course, the Boaz Correspondence publication that Regna is leading, and her team, of course, Josh and many others. And I've been asked to edit Boaz's Russian correspondence, which actually extends far beyond the well-known Jessup correspondence and continues throughout the 1930s and even 40s until his death. But more broadly, it's my interest in Boaz's ideas about Russia, both pre-revolutionary and Soviet, and his very warm relations with several Russian anthropologists, particularly Vladimir Bagaras. The aim of this paper is to examine a rather troubling chapter in the history of Boaz's activities as a public intellectual, and thus, in the spirit of the theme of this year's meetings, to demonstrate that at least some of the ideas and the actions of the father of American anthropologists, whom we love so dearly, which might seem familiar to us, were actually rather strange, or I would say actually politically and morally erroneous. My intention is to examine briefly Boaz's public stand on issues related directly to World War II in Europe, which he embraced in the wake of the infamous Stalin-Hitler Pact of August 39, and which he did not abandon until after Germany attacked the Soviet Union in late 41, where he completely changed his position. His position included a strong objection not only to America's involvement in the war on the side of Britain and France, but even to any aid to England, as well as a definite sudden scaling down of his anti-Nazi activities, and concentrating almost exclusively now on what he saw as a very dangerous threat to democracy in the United States. I will argue that Boaz's position, which he shared with the American Communist Party and other radical pacifists on the left, as well as the isolationists on the far right, had several roots or sources. I'm using his correspondence both with some of the Russians, but mostly with his various organizations and colleagues, as well as adversaries in the United States. Firstly, Boaz clearly viewed, this is my argument, the Second World War through the lens of World War I. And it shows in his intense fear of anti-German sentiments in the United States that he anticipated happening all over again, a strong distrust of Great Britain, and a lack of appreciation of the degree of Hitler's support among the German population. He really thought that most Germans were still not pro-Nazi. Boaz tended to exaggerate the danger of totalitarianism and fascism in the United States in the late 30s, or at least he incorrectly tended to equate Nazi totalitarianism with certain real anti-democratic practices in United States political life of that era. That's two. Thirdly, Boaz's socialist views influenced his lingering pro-Soviet sympathies in that period, despite his knowledge of and strong disagreement with the violence exercised by the Stalin regime against its own citizens, the lack of democracy in the USSR, and the lack of democracy. So the ideals of socialism and communism were something that he shared with the communists, both in the USSR and in the United States. And consequently, he completely failed to see the Stalin-Hitler Pact as a total evil, which is what it was. Thus, in 1939 and through the summer of 41, Boaz continued to practice his earlier refusal to criticize the Soviet regime publicly, even though he did criticize it privately on a number of occasions, and in rather strong terms. So we have a real discrepancy here. Finally, in his pro-democracy activities in the United States, Boas found the American communists, to be his strongest allies, and for him that was enough to justify turning a blind eye to their undemocratic political methods, which he strongly disagreed with. Thus, I'm arguing in this paper that Boas demonstrated surprising naivete in his views on some key matters of international politics in the late 30s, early 40s. And also, his troubling willingness, at least in my view, to ally himself with the totalitarian politicians, the like of the Communist Party USA head Earl Browder, who actually turned out to be the Soviet spy eventually, although Boas didn't know that. And in my view, most troubling was his failure to appreciate the fact that by fighting Hitler, United States would be fighting the greatest evil of the 20th century, the perpetrator of the Jewish Holocaust. Okay, now some specific examples from his correspondence. Boas really saw the war that started in September 39, the war between Nazi Germany and Great Britain, as a struggle for power between European powers. I mean, he says that very clearly. And this position, in fact, caused him losing quite a few allies within the liberal community of scholars who used to support and ally themselves with him in his struggle for intellectual freedom and democratic rights. His support, for example, for anti-war and neutrality resolutions in the 1939-41 period within the American Association of Scientific Workers, where he was active, was strongly opposed by many of his former friends and allies. Here's an example, a letter from a prominent Princeton mathematician, Oswald Veblen, sharply criticized Boas and his isolationist allies in the so-called National Emergency Conference for Democratic Right for actually helping the Nazis win the war. And that's what he says. In his response to Veblen, Boas says that the victory of either side, the British/French or the Nazis, would be bad for the United States. Hitler's victory, he says, might encourage Americans to support an American dictator. But the Allies' victory would lead to, quote, retaliatory peace that would breed wars and revolutions without end and which will affect our internal affairs no less deeply than a Nazi victory. He continued by saying that given this situation, he could not support the victory of either side. He also expressed strong distrust of the goals of the Allies, given their conduct in World War I. In his view, if the United States entered the war, it would sacrifice freedom within its own society. Finally, another quote, I reserve the final judgment until the war reaches a point when one side is the victor, but hope that both sides exhaust themselves. Paraphrasing Bismarck, he says, Europe is not worth the bones of a single American soldier. And I can't help myself, but to me it sounds like Rand Paul here or Donald Trump. No wonder that Albert Einstein and 70 other American scientists publicly repudiated his stance. I mean, so I'm not really being, my position is clear here because the Stalin-Hitler pact was a horrible thing. But Einstein and 70 other physicians actually wrote a letter to the New York Times attacking Boas for this. Similarly, several prominent leaders of the German-American League for Culture, where Boas was quite active in the 30s, resigned from this group because they saw the League's very strong neutral position, which was Boas's position, as actually in reality being pro-German. Finally, we have reminiscences of several of Boas's associates and also of other folks who saw him wearing actually a big button during this period which said, Roosevelt is a warmonger. Now, let's take a very brief look at the position taken on the same issue of the war by the American Committee for Democracy and Intellectual Freedom, the famous organization established by Franz Boas and Helles at Columbia in March '39. I'm going to skip the history of the organization because at first it was called something else, Lincoln Birthday Committee and so forth. It's a very important organization, actually fought for freedom of speech and various other wonderful and important things, and it's been written about. But my interest here is its position on the war. Boas has been criticized, or his organization, where he was really the leader, also very active in it was Ruth Benedict, and the secretary of the organization was Morris Fishbein, later known as Morris Finney, a very well-known classicist, but at that time he was very active in the Communist Party. But in their letters to Boas, a number of intellectuals who were on the liberal left but anti-Stalinist, they criticized Boas for ignoring Stalin's crimes. So they're saying, you're criticizing all these terrible things happening in the United States and some Nazis, Germany, but you're saying nothing about Stalin's crimes. In his response to inquiries from Columbia colleagues and other academics why intellectual freedom in Russia was not on his agenda of his organization, Boas, who only a year earlier was still willing to add his name to Dewey's Committee in Defense of Trotsky, wrote, "We in ACDIF do not wish to emphasize in our work what may happen in foreign countries, but we work to base our activities on what seems necessary here in America." So he's basically keeps saying now that we're only going to be concerned with the United States. We're not interested, or we can't change anything abroad. He's not being sincere because just recently he was quite outspoken in criticizing Franco's Spain or Mussolini's Italy, and suddenly he's saying only United States. Finally, I'll say a few words about his comments on Soviet Russia, which are very sort of contradictory. For example, when in 1932, Soviet newspaper Pravda began soliciting opinions by American intellectuals about the country on the occasion of the 15th anniversary of the so-called October Revolution, Boas responded, quote, "Humanity can only learn from what you're doing. Your great experiment deserves support." At the same time, in a private letter to his friend Bogoraz, the Russian scholar, he wrote in a more ambivalent language, quote, "The internal pressure in Nazi Germany must be quite similar to yours, but the great difference is that your ideals are human ideals with which I sympathize, but those of Germany are bigoted and very hateful." So the ideals are good, but the methods are bad. In his famous Anthropologist Credo, published in The Nation in 1938, he did lump Soviet Russia with Germany and Italy as our most modern despotic state, where the object of education is to develop power of the group. He was very well aware of and very critical of the ideological restrictions placed by both Nazi Germany and Soviet regime on science, for example. In his famous quote, in his famous statement and letter to a Columbia colleague, he says, quote, "I do know that in the USSR genetics is in disfavor, and I do know that in anthropology there is no freedom. Anthropology there must be Marxist and Morgan, otherwise it's not allowed." So he knows what's going on. He didn't read Russian, but he had, one of his sons-in-law was a Russian speaker, and I think he knew quite well what was going on. But this commitment to socialism, I think, kind of blinded him or forced him not to say critical things in public. As late as 1936, he voted for Norman Thomas for the Socialist Party and publicly stated that socialism and freedom were not incompatible, but somehow socialism in general and Soviet communism, he still saw them as being related. Finally, this position, this pro-neutralist position cost him dearly. For example, a number of American Jewish organizations wrote him critical letters and saying, your neutralism actually helps, it ends up being sort of soft on Nazism. You stopped criticizing Germans, because, and this is what the communists are doing as well, because after the Stalin-Hitler Pact, of course, Stalin's directives to the communists in America and elsewhere was, this is an imperialist war in Europe, and we're not criticizing them. The American Jewish Committee cut funding for Boas's research on race. And here's a quote that's really shows how naive he was. I know I'm running out of time. He's writing to Ruth Benedict in October of '39, quote, "It seems to me fairly clear that Hitler," this is commenting on the pact, "it seems fairly clear that Hitler is now a pawn in Stalin's hands, and that Stalin would like Western Europe and Germany to bleed to death following the pact. Only I don't know whether he would like that to happen for the sake of his own power or for the sake of communism." All right. So neutrality, yeah, we're wrapping up. And then this interesting argument that I think we could argue, and I know we don't have time for discussion with this new schedule they have here at AAA, but I'm sure this is a controversial paper. Some of you may not agree with me, but if you have ideas, I welcome comments afterwards or emails. Boas basically says that I don't like the communist methods. There's no democracy in their party, and they don't treat those they disagree with, in these American communists, politely, and they're disruptive. But on the issue of fighting for democracy in America, they're my allies. And that's what matters, basically, that, on this journey, they're my allies, and that's what matters. And at least to me, this is not a very attractive position, because, you could have allies that are really unattractive. In fact, he writes to Browder that however much I disagree with the methods of your party and the demand for obedience of party members, I recognize that the final ideals of your party agree with those of mine. All right, I end here. As soon as the Soviet Union is attacked, of course, the American Communist Party announces that the imperialist war in Europe suddenly becomes a just war of democracy against evil. And Boas jumps on the bandwagon. He sends a telegram to the Soviet embassy saying that he's in full support of the war. And so I'm strongly in disagreement with Julia Lissa's article in Volume 1 of the Boas Correspondence, where Julia says that Boas remains a pacifist until the day he dies, that he was against America's involvement in the war. His letters don't support that. So I don't know where Julia got the idea. I think it's her own politics that got in the way. He certainly was for America's involvement after invasion of Russia, and certainly after Pearl Harbor. So, and here's my last quote. I apologize, and I'll end here. Margaret Mead writing, quote, "Boas believed that he would be able to spot a communist at once by his lack of intellectual independence, which he felt sure would show through everything. He remained scornful of attacks on many of the causes with which he associated himself, his uncompromising attitude insulating him from any education on the subject of communist methods." Thank you.
Spotlights?
Yeah, the lights are off.
Yeah, well. Okay. I was going to talk quite explicitly about the way in which Boas is a forerunner of biocultural synthesis and how he got from anthropometry to plasticity, which will be one forthcoming volume of the Boas papers. I think, however, there is underbrush to be cleared away first in how we got beyond the study of the American Indian, how we came to a more general position. So I want to give you some of the tenets of that from the point of view of history of anthropology and the range of the scholarship going into the documentary edition of the Boas papers. I argue that The Mind of Primitive Man in 1911 set out a theoretical position that would preoccupy Boas for the rest of his life, and that he was fully cognizant of the integration of his core ideas at that time. In both the 1911 and 1938 editions, we have a legitimate scientific paradigm, an explanatory as well as descriptive theory, providing a systematic program for Americanist anthropology. The elements of this paradigm are explicitly articulated. Boas set a high standard for theory, insisting that it be based on scientifically rigorous methodology, even when dealing with qualitative ethnographic or psychological phenomena. Human biological variability, more amenable to such methodology, was his starting point for the study of mind as well as of body. Culture, in his view, was dynamic and grounded in a specific environment operating in history. Traditional classifications of race, language, and culture are separate analytically and non-comparable. Biological determinism threatened the very existence of civilization, salvageable only by science and scientific method. Boas lamented the counterproductive blinders imposed by Euro-American ethnic prejudice. Freedom of thought, the sine qua non of science, could be protected only by valuing racial and cultural diversity. Boas's analytic lens shifted from the biological to the cultural and back again, but he steadfastly refused to consider them independently of their mutual entailments. The paradigm transcended subject matters and inductive or deductive methods to explore human nature, history, and civilization. Civilization is a term he uses more often than culture. A persistent inherited stereotype is that Boas was not a theorist. His legendary 6-foot shelf of Kwakiutl ethnography, replete with blueberry recipes, has been ridiculed as meaningless empiricism, glossing over the significance of blueberries to the cultural practices and livelihood of the Kwakwaka'wakw, the people he called Kwakiutl. The meta-narrative tells us that if Boas had any theoretical ideas, they have long since outlived their utility. It seems clear today, however, that the critique of evolution is now irrelevant because that battle has been won. He argued persuasively that the evolutionists' embodiment of themselves as the culmination of human civilization was based on premature generalization about both human nature and human history. Such a position might be construed as merely a theory of absence based in negation, except that Boas did not stop there. Rather, he offered a methodology, a mentalist standpoint epistemology that entailed fundamental rethinking of the verities of science and purported objectivity of scientific method. A mentalist theory is not necessarily a theoretical, although it may, of course, be deemed non-rigorous by some when judged by the criteria of their own non-mentalist theories. Another facile stereotype is that Boas was a theorist for one shining moment in 1911, when he published both The Mind of Primitive Man and his introduction to the Handbook of American Indian Languages. Never again, we are told, did he attempt to synthesize his theoretical position. I'll spare you my comments on Stocking and Douglas Cole. Two critical thoughts emerged in the 1911 synthesis. Race, language, and culture are separate. The universality of the human mind across geographical regions, forms of life, by which he means subsistence patterns, and cultures, operated regardless of the biological makeup of the societies or their individual members. These insights, of course, are now so taken for granted that it appears common sense rather than a theoretical breakthrough away from ethnocentrism. The Boasian legacy, thus, requires contemporary contextualization. Post-war anthropology, I'm sorry, I shortened this immensely to get it into the time. Post-war anthropology turned to positivism and faith in technology as the harbinger of modern progress, with mentalism out of fashion and Boas seeming increasingly old-fashioned. Anthropologists, like high-energy physicists, wanted to be scientific. Ironically, since physics itself increasingly challenged the parameters of linear logic and stable dimensions. Many of Boas's successors developed neo-evolutionary paradigms. For example, Leslie White and Marvin Harris, writing in the 1960s, have been taken in their critique of Boas by many commentators at face value without returning to the originals. In the interim, the theoretical paradigm of the social sciences has shifted back toward mentalism, or perhaps to the irrelevance of the distinction in the first place. Excuse me. Boas now stands out as far ahead of his time, calling for an anthropology prescient in his day, but even more robustly resonant in our own. Boas used his course of lectures at Boston's Lowell Institute and the National University of Mexico in 1910-11 to consolidate the position he had been developing since the 1880s and lightly reworked a series of papers for his synthesis. Each dealt with one or more planks of his emerging theory of mind. Boas's preface listed the previously published works incorporated and baldly asserted that the constituent pieces were revised, enlarged, and embedded in a new framework. The juxtaposition added up to more than the sum of its parts. He intended it as a paradigm statement. Human faculty is determined by race at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, argued that race was a misleading, emotionally laden, and scientifically inaccurate term for attested human variability. The limitations of the comparative method of anthropology articulated the critique of unilinear evolution. In 1901, The Mind of Primitive Man, from which he took his title, argued to the American Folklore Society about the universal products of human mind and the histories of the communities producing them. Traits of primitive culture debunked stereotypes about the primitive and the concept itself. Boas applied his emerging synthesis of biology and culture to the race problem in America, published in Science, the preeminent arbiter of professional science in America. It's interesting, the biggest difference between the 1911 and 1938 editions is that it was Race in America in 1911 and Race in Nazi Germany in 1938, but the substance of the argument and the examples are identical, or virtually identical, in the two editions. Same argument. Psychological Problems of Anthropology identified psychology, the science of the mental, as a critical discipline for the legitimization of anthropology itself. What Boas did in The Mind of Primitive Man that was so remarkable is, in the first instance, I think, methodological. Because he believed that mind and theory were inseparable in science, his thought experiments, in the absence of conclusive data, allowed him to articulate a general theory, and this transformed everything. He began to talk about the mind of his title, primitive or otherwise, by talking about body, about biological variability. He adopted this strategy because the methods of biological sciences were more advanced than those for studying culture, and he was eager to reason analogically from one to the other. Another inaccurate inherited stereotype is that Boas was a culturalist and that his theory of culture was static. In Mind of Primitive Man, however, he rarely uses the term culture independently. It's culture/environment. His binary to biology is not culture, but environment. He asks why one group of people is different from another, and turns to biology as explanation only as a last resort, and when forms of life, of gaining a living, can be held constant. His method of defamiliarization toggles between one set of variables and another. From the standpoint of biology, plasticity is the core of variability, and culture is held constant, with environment as its explanatory mechanism. The inductive method, in the face of limited data, is parallel to that of Darwin's natural selection. From the standpoint of environment culture, however, variability is rampant, and the possibility of equal value to civilizations other than our own holds constant and equal species-level capacity for mental development. Value, like the plasticity of bodily form, is a matrix that operates in the eye of the beholder. The predictability of biological form, cultural form, the histories of particular groups, and environmental context all potentially dissolve into a sea of multivariate complexity that broadens the desiderata of adequate theory: biology, culture, archaeology, language. Any classification is arbitrary because variability necessarily exceeds its bounds when one switches the beholder's classificatory lens. Hence, the analytic discreteness of race, language, and culture. Boas's classic first generation of students all acknowledged, though they sometimes chafed against, his institutional leadership that created a consensus for anthropology, a normal science in the Kuhnian parlance we might use today. None of them matched the breadth of Boas's own work. Each specialized in some part of the package and developed theory within it rather than across other areas. The students developed their own specializations and rarely articulated the common assumptions of what became the Americanist tradition, that is, the Boasian paradigm. After his forced retirement in 1936, Boas turned to ensuring his legacy. The discipline remembers primarily his late career activism against Nazi racism and his 1928 Anthropology in Modern Life. Crucially, however, he revised The Mind of Primitive Man in 1938 and compiled his published essays under the title Race, Language, and Culture in 1940. These were the works he hoped to enshrine as the culmination of his life work. As in The Mind of Primitive Man, Boas begins Race, Language, and Culture with the relative methodological rigor of race biology and ends with culture ethnology. The final section is explicitly labeled methodology. Language has a more explicit mediating role in the analytic triad than it did in 1911, as an attractive starting point more akin to culture than is biology. The logic of inference, that is theory, is directly parallel to that employed in The Mind of Primitive Man. Boas saw himself first and foremost as a scientist. The problem was to deal with mental phenomena in scientifically rigorous ways by applying insights from more fully studied or easily measured areas of study to other areas until the whole succumbed to scientific method, thereby mitigating the relative fuzziness of culture. The 1938 preface acknowledged recent changes in research, particularly in heredity, the influence of environment on bodily form and behavior, and the mental attitudes of primitive man. Interestingly, primitive is in quotation marks here, as it is not anywhere in The Mind of Primitive Man, 1911. Boas insisted that he had come to, quote, an ever-increasing certainty of his conclusions, that, quote, no fundamental difference in the ways of thinking of primitive and civilized man can be identified by science. The updated scientific results from overlapping disciplines were described by him here as new points of view, a position that maintained the standpoint of the scientist at the center of his epistemology. He contrasts the logical as well as biological revisionism of biology, psychology, and anthropology that concur in challenging popular prejudice. In the context of, in 1938, of the gathering clouds over Hitler's Europe, underscoring the urgency of effectively disseminating his views, Boas observed darkly, the suppression of intellectual freedom rings the death knell of science. Now, he may have been wildly naive in how he did that in his various international efforts, but I think it is precisely this notion of science and of the integrity within a single potential framework of the kinds of knowledge that constitute a broadly defined science of humankind that is something we can go back to and see what happens with as we retrace the roots and look at how they have come down to us in contemporary work. Thank you.
My apologies, we're well over time, and I see some of the people arriving to stand the next session. I don't know, maybe we can take one quick question? Well, I really appreciate the turnout. I'm really grateful for all of you coming to our session today, and my thanks to the executive committee. Anyone who wants to get in touch with the Franz Boas Papers Project, or you want to send questions in, or access any of the panelists about any of the topics at all, you should be able to find us through the Franz Boas Papers online, through the Western University of Ontario. And we have a Facebook site. Post some questions there if you didn't get to ask them today, and we'll be sure to follow up with those. Thank you again, everyone, for coming, hearing us talk, and my thanks to my colleagues. And
Thank you for organizing, John.
yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. I had a lot of help. Thanks.